Thank you so much for having me.
We are so excited to have you. So one of the claims that you make is that, and you've written this, you've said that, quote, the global climate crisis is existential, and especially for Black and Indigenous peoples. And then you've gone on to say that, quote, in our era, climate justice and reparations are the same project, and that any politically serious reparations project has to focus on climate change. So can you break these claims down for us, especially for the young people in the audience? How is it that addressing the climate crisis and reparations are, as you put it, the same project?
So I think to think through this, it's really helpful to reflect on everything that Dr. Monroe was just explaining about what I guess you could call a version of climate change that happened in the African continent, right? The desiccation of the Sahara, change to what the environment looked like, what ways of living, whether it was pastoralism or something more agricultural, what ways were possible, right? The environment is changing, the ground is getting drier, and people who are used to living life one way can't live life that way anymore, at least in the exact place that they were living that way before, and they have to move. And what she's finding from the anthropological evidence is that the movement of people, there were norms in place, there were cultures in place, there were practices that allowed people to move, allowed whole populations, whole groups of people to move from places that were being depopulated to places that were getting more and more people living there. Those involved social networks, those involved communal understandings of who was allowed to live places, who was allowed to move. And it's because those structures were in place, those cultural attitudes, those practices, those norms, that when a climate crisis happened thousands of years ago, it didn't necessarily result in mass death and mass violence. There were peaceful ways of changing who lived where. Now look at our world. Imagine that kind of calamity in our world, which, by the way, is one of the predictions scientists are making about the climate crisis, that large parts of the world where people live now are going to be more and more difficult for people to live. People are going to be displaced, and they're going to have to find other places to go. Now we have border walls and border security regimes, and we have institutions like ICE that throw people in detention centers and camps and that point guns at people when they need to move. And that's not something that's just especially true about movement. In general, we've built the world in a way where the rich parts of the world think of themselves as fortresses to try to keep out people from poorer parts of the world, and especially Black people wherever they are on the planet. And that's the kind of political situation that we're heading to into the 21st century. And that's what we have to deal with. So when we talk about reparations, when we talk about trying to make changes to the world based on what's happened in the past, that's the future we're heading towards.
So one of the, perhaps you heard one of the Harlem Village Academy students say that reparations aren't just about money, which is really the way that in mainstream media in particular, contemporaneously, we've tended to hear about reparations, that, you know, somebody's going to get a check, somebody's going to cut a check. Is she on to something? Is reparations more than money? And of course, I'm asking rhetorically because your own work delves into previous generations that have advocated reparations and how they've thought about it.
Yeah, I think that student is definitely right. But I think, it's important to frame it carefully, right? Some people, when you say reparations is not just about money, they hear, oh, reparations is really about apologies, or it's about making amends, or it's about, getting right with God or something, on behalf of the people that are connected to harm doing institutions. And that's not the way that I think about it. The way I think about it is, money plus. Money is going to be involved, but what are individuals, households, governments going to do with the money that moves from the corporations and countries that have hoarded it to, the people that have been plundered from, right? What is it that we're going to do with the resources that are being redistributed? And I was really struck by something Alama said. I believe that's the name of the student who spoke first in the video that played just before this, that, something that demonstrates the need for new chances and new opportunities, which is connected to how that student thinks of reparations, is what it is that people see around them every day, right? Which isn't necessarily an Excel spreadsheet saying how much everybody makes, but is probably stuff like infrastructure that doesn't work, people who have to work hours that are, that stress them out and make it more difficult for them to, relate to people around them in a way that isn't constantly being hurt by stress, like those things, those aspects of what people's environment is like, is what communicates to people, what it means to be working class. That's what it communicates to people, what they can expect in life, and which people the world and the power structures care about, and which people are just here to work for everybody else. And I think it's important to keep the importance of moving money in mind while still being committed to, we have to actually change what people's environment is like, and not in this kind of spiritual, rhetorical way, but really literally change what their housing is like, what transportation is like. And that's the kind of changes I'm talking about when I say, frighteningly large things like we should remake the world.
So one of the things that you stress, and we touched upon this early at the very beginning in the remarks of Dr. Dorinda Carter Andrews, who did our keynote, that in order to understand why some parts of the world consistently appear to be better off than others, and the other parts of the world, Africa in particular, appear to be in a constant state of desperation. That we have to understand that this is not the natural order of things. That in the current world system was built on something you call the global racial empire. And again, we touched on this earlier, and that it's essential that we understand this history. And I so admire, as a historian, the way you put this. And I'm quoting heavily from this beautiful book, which I think should be assigned to high school students. You say, quote, "History is not merely an interesting point of comparison for our contemporary problems. Everything we experience happens in the flow of time from past to present to future. And so when we struggle to stay afloat in the present, to access healthcare, to secure food, to form healthy relationships, we are swimming among the currents of history," unquote. And you draw a striking and I think enormously helpful analogy. You say, quote, we can look at the politico-economic system of the world as something like a water management system, a web of aqueducts that span the globe, channeling instead of water, advantages and disadvantages from one place to another. The stones of the aqueducts that conduct and discipline the continuous motion of the past into the future were laid in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. And you encapsulate the ongoing impact of this global political economic system as that of cumulative advantage and cumulative disadvantage. Can you say a little bit more about how this works?
Everything that we deal with in our current world started somewhere. The institutions that we're in, the countries that those institutions are in, those things were created at points in time. And the resources that they use, the wealth that's in those countries, as a result of the wealth, the budgets that those institutions have to work with, all those things are built up over time. And the things that explain how much they built over time are the things that explain our present circumstances. One of the examples I actually use in the book is Georgetown, which is where I'm employed, which is, the story of how I pay rent. It's the story of, how it is that I access, audiences like this one, right? The story of why it is that a publisher would agree to publish my book, and why, and part of why people would agree to look at whatever it says. That happens because of the same things that explain the beginning of this country. Georgetown is in roughly the region where the Jamestown colony was, that started what became the United States. When Georgetown was a very young school, it sold 272 enslaved Africans to help keep itself afloat. And over the years, it's continued to build buildings, build relationships, acquire funding. And that's the thing that explains, the institution as we find it now. Countries are like that. Organizations are like that. And in general, the world is like that. What the world is built on is slavery on a scale much larger than, Georgetown, which is just one example of this much larger thing in history. Millions of people trafficked across the Atlantic Ocean, trade networks built across the Atlantic Ocean, the Indian Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, all the world's oceans, all the world's populated continents, brought together in systems and networks of trade and economics and politics. And it's because of how those connections were built that explain which countries are rich and which countries are poor, that explain which organizations have lots of resources and which have less resources, that explain why some schools have lots of advantages and other schools don't, whether we're talking about high schools or colleges or kindergartens. And I think those are the that's the scale that I think is helpful to think about when thinking about remaking the world and thinking about climate justice.
So I want to step back a moment and highlight the fact that you're a philosopher.
Yeah.
And so what was it that brought you to this subject as a philosopher? And you know, in this convening, we like to know people's backstory. You know, we're not just interested in where you went to school and what degrees you earned. We're interested in you as a member of the African diaspora, indeed the more recent iteration of the African diaspora, given that your parents were African born, I believe. You know, what was it like for you as a young Black boy in school? And what was it that led you on this journey and to become a philosopher, and then to grapple with this particular topic and to see a close connection between, an inextricable connection, as I understand it, between addressing the climate crisis and reparations?
So I grew up in the Midwest. My parents came here in the 80s. They were born during the British colonial domination of Nigeria. So myself, my siblings, were the first generation to be born after independence of our family, at least. And from a young age, I think my first philosophical question was why we were here, right? I think my parents gave me the impression that, you know, there was at least a time where they thought that Nigeria was going to progress in a different direction than it did. But there was a civil war. There were a number of military coups. Things deteriorated. And so, you know, we weren't the only ones. There was a big Nigerian American community where I grew up. So on the one hand, there were lots of white people, lots of African American people, and then this Nigerian American community, all of which I'm interacting with as I grow up in the US. And, you know, even at a young age, it seemed like these three worlds are different. The expectations are different. Where they understand themselves in the world is different. How they understand history is different. And so a lot of the kind of curiosity that ended up pushing me in the direction of studying philosophy when I got earlier was just me trying to make sense of my own life in, you know, I think a fairly kind of normal way. Why is it that these people think this and those people think that? But as I got older, I grew more and more dissatisfied with the kinds of explanations that people were giving me about those questions. You know, there was a lot of racism. So, you know, racists have one set of answers as to why it is that those people act like that and these people act like this. But there are lots of other kinds of bigotry as well. But more than bigotry, there just, I think, was a lack of curiosity. People just accepted it as a fact of the world, that people were different from each other, and some people had higher levels of poverty and incarceration and dealt with more health problems, and people just didn't try to answer the question of why that was. And when I took classes in, you know, the sorts of things that might seem like, the sorts of fields that might seem like they study why it is that different people get treated differently, my economics classes, I didn't find the answers. In my political science classes when I was in college. And so I figured, I started studying philosophy because I thought, well, at least there you get to question the assumptions behind whatever it is you're studying, as opposed to an economics class where they just build the assumptions into the math and then make you do math or something like that. And then, as some of you might know, philosophy wasn't necessarily any more interested in the questions I was asking about the history of the world or Black people than economics was or political science was. But I at least had the space to ask those questions myself, even if my colleagues weren't always asking the exact same questions I was. And that's kind of how I ended up where I ended up.
And so I took note that one of your inspirations was Charles Mills, the Jamaican-born philosopher who wrote The Racial Contract, which I encountered sometime, and I read it and, didn't understand most of it, but I intuited what he was getting across, which was that these structures, and I think this is where you were going, more than bigotry, there's a global structure that even if today everybody stopped being bigoted, is such that these cumulative disadvantages and cumulative advantages will flow in certain directions. So I have that right?
That's exactly right. Charles Mills is, of course, has a really famous, in my field, philosophy, a really famous discussion of this kind of thing. There have been other authors. A historian, Eric Williams, who's Trinidadian, said a lot about this. African-American scholars, Huey Newton, who was obviously a Panther. There's been a lot of places where I've learned a different way of thinking about how the world is put together that isn't so based on, deciding which people are bad people or which people discriminate or which people, think less of other people. And obviously racism in the sense of bigotry, discrimination, thinking less of people, obviously that's everywhere. It just doesn't explain all by itself all the things that happen in the world and why the world works the way that it does. And so I think kind of holding on to our opposition to racism in the sense of racial discrimination, while also paying attention to, well, how is it that banks work, right? How is it that our laws function or don't function on an international basis? What even is international law? Those kinds of questions that aren't necessarily about what any person deep in their heart feels about people from Africa or the Caribbean or African Americans or anyone, but that are deeply tied to what life is like for all of those people. Asking and trying to answer some of those systemic questions is, what I've been spending the last few years doing my best at trying to do.
And so one of your big solution is that we have to remake the world, and that reparations is the way to do that. And you also say, but that's so overwhelming. I mean, how do we do that? What do you say to those Harlem Village Academy students say, remake the world? What are you talking about? And I want to get to being a good ancestor, but if you could start first with that, how do we remake the world? What do you mean by that?
So, again, I want to give credit to the first student who spoke in the video that played right before this. Alama, I think was their name, who was talking about their surroundings, like what it is that a student going to school might see on the way to school, right? What are the working conditions of the adults that they're hanging around? Do those people, feel rested and ready to be their best selves, or are those people on their 30th hour of, you know, their second job, right? Do they see transportation systems that work and that are free and easy to access for everyone? Or do they see people, you know, who are trying to jump turnstiles because they can't afford the fare and being chased down by cops, right? All these little things, which just seem like isolated parts of the world, add up to this total experience of, you know, how a student going to school might see themselves in the world. And none of those things are about ideas. None of those things are just, you know, purely attitudes or impressions that the student has. They're actual things that they might see when they're going to school. They're actual transportation systems. They are actual working conditions. And what I'm trying to say is that those are the things that we need to change. That's the kind of thing that we need to change, not who's apologized to whom, but actually in concrete ways, how the world is put together if we want to tackle the climate crisis. To be a little more specific, often when people think about reparations, they think about checks, right? Somebody gets a check in the mail for an amount of money, and that money represents something about the oppression that their ancestors went through, which would include slavery and lots of other aspects of racial domination, in this case in the US, but the Caribbean is also pushing for this as well. And I think all those are good impulses. But I think we can think more holistically about what it is that needs to be done. And I don't want to skew too much in the policy direction. But if we changed how much funding goes towards redoing infrastructure around the world and who's on the hook for paying that funding, both funding towards Black communities in the United States and in the Caribbean and on the continent and in South America and wherever else around the world people are. I think those sorts of transformative investments would be the kinds of things that would fit under remaking the world. But the other main category of thing, besides building hospitals and transportation networks and giving people money, which absolutely should be, you know, part of what we push for, is changing how the decisions get made about all of the above. Right now, we have political structures that let small classes of people decide functionally what it's going to be like for a student going to school in Harlem, right? Decide, you know, a small council of city council people and state senators that meet in Albany, New York, and Congress people that meet in Washington, D.C., functionally decide what a student is going to see when they get out of bed in Manhattan and go outside and try to go to school every day. And I think there are so many ways for lobbyists and corporations and, you know, narrow private rich people interests to get their hooks in on the people that make all those decisions and steer those decisions in ways that, you know, tell some kids that they aren't worth anything and tell other kids that they're worth the world. I think a better decision-making format would be more democratic, more participatory, and I think decision-making that was more democratic and more participatory would probably be more fair. And this isn't some, pie in the sky idealism. In fact, there are things like participatory budgeting, where which was pioneered by the Brazilian Workers' Party, where people got together in like a town hall and decided in a group how the city's money was going to be spent. In fact, in New York, this is being done on an extremely small scale, but it could be done on a much larger scale. It could be done, in fact, with all of the city money rather than, a few percentage points of a percentage point of the city's overall budget. And if we made decisions that way, I guess that the NYPD wouldn't have one of the top 10 defense budgets in the world as it currently has now. I would think that there would be much more fair distributions of public resources if we let people actually decide rather than functionally letting rich people decide. So it is about moving money, but it's also about moving political power in direct ways. And I think you put those two things together and you get a recipe for remaking the world.
So what do you mean by being a good ancestor? And I mean, to whom does that prescription apply?
I think it applies to all of us. So say the vision that I was just kind of sketching, the idea that money gets moved from the rich parts of the world to poorer parts of the world, from the white parts of the world to blacker parts of the world, and not just money, but decision-making power. So we meet in town halls across the US and the Caribbean and the African continent, and it's those kind of community formats that end up deciding not just how much money is moving and where it's moving, but what we're going to do when the money and labor hours and knowledge resources arrive. How should we make those decisions? Right? What should we do with that power? And I think part of what we are kind of forced into doing because of how quickly, especially in this country, in the United States, how quickly things can go badly for us, how quickly people can lose their homes, how quickly people can lose their healthcare. We're forced into this kind of short-term mindset where we're thinking about living paycheck to paycheck and making decisions paycheck to paycheck. But the kind of culture that Dr. Monroe was describing just a few moments ago was a culture where people were thinking across generations. How do we manage these cattle? How do we manage this water in a way that makes sure that my children and my children's children and their children are going to have sustainable access to those things? What kind of knowledge do we need to build so that we can preserve everything that we want for ourselves, for everyone that comes after us? Whether there are biological children or just the people that come after us that we feel a sense of responsibility to. And I think when we make decisions from that kind of mind frame, with that kind of long view, in indigenous studies, they sometimes talk about the 7 generations model, where you think about 7 generations before you and 7 generations after, however it is that we frame it. How is it that we get into that mindset, and not just get into that mindset, but actually make the decisions and manage the world around us in a way that is sustainable, that does preserve the world and the possibility of living in a healthy and flourishing fashion for all the people that come after us? That mindset is thinking like an ancestor. but acting like an ancestor, doing the things that maintain the health of our soil and air and water and institutions. Acting like an ancestor in that sense is what's important to me.
That's beautiful. Who did you write this book for? You know, you heard me say that high school students should be assigned it. I know that for some scholars, they would not appreciate that as the compliment that I intended to be. But who did you write it for?
I was really, you know, I take it as a compliment. I take it as the highest compliment, because I felt like I was writing it for people who are students now, and the way that I wrote it, you know, the way that I tried to write it for people who are students now is by thinking, you know, what was it that I needed when I was a student? So we talked a little bit earlier about me trying to figure out the world around me and figure out my place in it, and studying all these things in high school and college and not really feeling as though I found something that spoke to the questions that I was asking about the world, or that gave me the language or the ideas of where to look to, you know, start to try to figure those things out for myself. And that's my hope with the book, you know, not necessarily that, you know, students now are brilliant in so many ways that I couldn't possibly anticipate, and will think of things I didn't think of, and will, you know, and will have different opinions from me, and all that is fine. But I just wanted to, you know, my hope was to write a book that could start a conversation, that students who have these sorts of questions about what reparations is like, how climate is changing, the possibilities for justice, can have somewhere to start and think about what kinds of history would be involved in tackling that question, can think about what kinds of philosophical and political perspectives might be part of thinking through that question, and have something that brings all those different things together.
And do you have any advice for teachers, you know, for how they can best utilize and pass on and the knowledge to their students, you know, from your book and from other resources? We've had educators. We had our keynote, Dr. Dorinda Carter Andrews, who is the dean of the School of Education at Michigan State, and an extraordinarily committed and effective educator of K through 12 herself. What do you, as a scholar in the academy, what useful suggestions can you make to educators at the K through 12 level?
Well, I mean, to be honest, you know, I would love to hear from K through 12 educators about what they make of it, right? And get some advice from them about, you know, what those of us who are in higher ed should be producing, and what would be helpful, and what is working in your classrooms. But I will say, you know, my sense is that what reaches students is extremely local. And so pairing this big picture, global, planetary scale stuff with, in your neighborhood, this is what the trees look like now, and here's what they looked like 40 years ago. Here is why your neighborhood this summer is hotter and more dangerous in a heat wave than the neighborhood over there. Here is the history of that, and not just, you know, pointing out that they have trees and you don't, but here's why. I think when, you know, I think my experience in classrooms is that when it gets that local, people understand that the global picture of things isn't actually an abstraction. It actually is the same thing as the local thing. It's just harder to find, you know, visual experience level examples of, you know, something that large. So if you give them something smaller and something that matters in their own lives, they might have more patience with some of the big picture stuff.
Well, now you said something at the beginning of this response that was very intriguing. You said that you were interested in learning from K through 12 educators about, which quite frankly is refreshing. And you know, we're going to try to take you up on that.
Please.
You know, what is your sense of your colleagues in the academy? There's all this wonderful knowledge being produced. And one of the frustrations that I hear from K through 12 educators repeatedly is that they don't have a sense that scholars in the academy care about what they do. And as you're probably aware, educators in K through 12, they are, I mean, you know, we know that there are political pressures being exerted on educators at all levels, but K through 12, yeah. My goodness. Yeah. So what do you say to your colleagues? You know, what's your assessment? Is the perception that not enough of them are interested in what happens at that level? Is that accurate? Or are there structures that they're bound by? And how might we overcome these barriers?
I think it's both. So I think there are structures that we're bound by as folks who teach at the college or university level, that are kind of designed to curb our attention, right? We have to produce papers, which you know, submitting a paper to an academic journal means paying a lot of meticulous attention to what you think other people in your field at your level are doing. And that kind of shuts off the rest of the world. But I think even considering that, we should be paying way more attention, and we should be way more concerned with what's happening at the K through 12 level, especially those of us who are studying climate politics, because we know that, you know, the people who are in K through 12 now are having their future decided by the things that we're failing to do now. And so we should be very concerned with how, you know, the people whose job it is to educate young folks are thinking, and we should be, you know, in line with them and in solidarity with them. And I think one of the things that might help build those kinds of connections is challenging the kind of exceptional culture that you have in higher ed. You know, I think higher ed, my experience of higher ed is that there's a lot of people who are very reluctant to think of themselves as workers, you know, to think of themselves as doing a job, right? You know, we're doing our special creative projects, and we just happen to get money for doing that, and the university just happens to get money for allowing us to do these things, and because we don't think of ourselves as workers, that helps us by this artificial distinction between, you know, what we're doing and what K through 12 teachers are doing, when in fact we're all doing the thing of educating and trying to instill knowledge and values into the people who we will pass the baton to, whose job it will be to run the world, you know, after us, thinking like ancestors, right? And every society, if it's going to survive and, you know, be worth surviving, needs to take that seriously. And if we thought of ourselves as workers, we would notice that K through 12 teachers are at the forefront of the labor movement right now. It's some of the most exciting things that are happening in defending the rights of workers are being advanced by teachers' unions. And whether it's the teachers unions in Los Angeles or in Chicago or West Virginia. They've not only shown an ability to fight for themselves, but to fight for their students and to fight for the communities that their students come from. And, you know, the more we college and university level educators can learn from the K through 12 example on that, I think the easier it will be to change our mindset when it comes to education itself.
Have you seen this? Have you seen, are you aware of alliances of like this taking place anywhere in higher ed and K through 12 that you can point us to? If you're not, I mean.
Yeah, so my understanding is that a lot of Rutgers is a particularly good example of this. There's a faculty union there that is not just representing faculty, but is in coalition with adjuncts and graduate workers and staff workers of other kinds on the campus. And they've, you know, made it their business to show up and for other kinds of educators, even outside of Rutgers. That's the example that's coming to mind right now. But I think, you know, I wish I had 10 examples, right? I wish this was the norm in academic culture, and I think it's going to take some work for us to get there.
Is there anything that I haven't asked you that you would like to answer, Professor Taiwo? Again, we're gonna be coming back to you.
There was one other thing that I wanted to point out about the way that I think about remaking the world, which is just that I mean that literally, and because I mean that literally, I don't think, you know, I don't think it's as impossible as it might seem. I think it's impossible if you're thinking remaking the world means me right here doing the whole thing, right? You know, me right here destroying all the divisions between countries and me upending all the world's legislatures, you know. Jeff Bezos couldn't do that, you know, much less, you know, much less most of us who don't have $1 trillion or whatever. But anybody can plant a tree, right? That is a literal, concrete, physical change to what something around you is like. That, you know, changes a section of the world, right? Maybe more ambitiously, you know, a small group of people can change an institution, can start an energy initiative, can do an investigation of a corrupt company, can, you know, there are things that we can do to change what our actual physical surroundings are like and what our institutional surroundings are like, how our city council functions, or whether or not there's a mutual aid network, or whether or not there's an audience of people reading the investigations of the city council to make sure those people are held accountable. There are measurable changes we can make to the world around us that on their own are not going to remake the entire planet, but can be part of that. And so I think having a lofty goal doesn't mean giving up on the smaller goals. In fact, the only way you could possibly get to the big goal is by doing some of the smaller things. And so I always try to make sure to get that point across. Now, I'm not trying to tell people to despair when I emphasize how big the struggle is. I'm trying to do the opposite. I'm trying to show people how many opportunities they have to do something that would be part of the big goal of changing the planet. You have a planet-sized set of possibilities to get started.
Professor Taiwo, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm in the process of recharging my computer so we don't have another technological snafu. But this has been a rich conversation. Again, be forewarned, we're going to be coming back to you.
Please.
To continue it. We now, once you're part of an AI community forever, you're part of an AI community. Thank you so much for your work and for your contribution. And we look forward to continuing this conversation.
Thanks so much, everybody.